Ready? Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Kirby Lambert. I'm the Outreach and Interpretation Program Director for the Society. And we do a lot of public programs. There's a lot of familiar faces in here and a few new ones. This program is being offered as part of the Myrna Loy's One Robe Métis Cultural Festival and a tribute to the late Nicholas Vrooman. And we're very happy to be able to participate in that event and offer these programs. It's a great opportunity, and certainly I don't know if those of you who knew Nicholas Vrooman was a great guy and a huge supporter of the Historical Society and an amazing resource, somebody who is indeed sorely missed. Our program today, we're doing this at noon at 4:30. We will be back here with Dr. Brendan Resnick and on a related program about peoples of the borderlands, and that should be another great one. At 6, there is food at the Myrna Loy. That's always a good incentive to get people to come out. Oh, okay. So eat before you come, otherwise you'll be pretty hungry.
I'm leaving now.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, but 7:30, the festivities begin, and there's going to be music and of all kinds of great things. Chris, you want to say anything? It's sold out. Okay, just stay home tonight, would you? Anyway, that's great. Anyway, it's our pleasure today to see what. Oh, I think he's wanting you to turn that on.
It is on, yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, it's our pleasure today my pleasure to introduce you to Chris Latreille. Chris is a writer, poet, and musician, as well as the author of the award-winning book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large. He's an enrolled member of the Little Shell, which is a Native American tribe that only recently received recognition by the national government. And Chris is going to tell us a lot more about that today. Prior to this recognition, they were often known as the landless Indians of Montana. Chris's immense talents as a storyteller, combined with his unique personal perspective, allow him to offer a fresh approach to understanding the complexities of the modern-day American West. So please help me in welcoming Chris.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay with this? I've got so many wires and things going on. I feel like if I step in any direction, I'm going to bring half the museum down on me. So the day that finally came is directly related to this presentation, is about the Métis people, but largely about the federal recognition process for the Little Shell tribe. We've got a few Little Shell members. How many? Anybody raise their hands? It's nice to be among family today. Thank you for coming. So the title comes from an article that the historian Verne Dusenberry wrote for Montana, the magazine of Western history, in 1958, that was called Waiting for a Day That Never Comes, the Dispossessed Métis of Montana. So for us, the day that never comes was the day of our federal recognition, and then finally the day came, December 2019. So that's largely what this talk is going to be about. So first, who am I besides an immense talent, which that's the first that's ever been. I've been called immense before, but usually for other reasons. I grew up in what we'll talk about as the Métis archipelago, and I'll mention more what that means as we get a little deeper into the program. But I grew up in Frenchtown, which is west of Missoula, about 15 miles, which at the time that I was growing up, I had no idea that I had cultural relationship to a number of the families that were there. None of us had any idea. And that's part of our story, is the fact that not only does the community at large not know who we were, there were a lot of us living our lives not knowing who we were. So part of this federal recognition and part of this recreation of our culture as a tribe is kind of bringing everybody home. And that's a large part of the story, particularly for me, because I grew up in a family where my dad denied that we were related to any of the other Latreilles. And we're all related. And that was part of my journey to get from there to here, is trying to peel back why and who are we and where did we come from. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body, except for the one that makes you have to stay after class, things like that. I'm not a historian. I'm just a storyteller. And for me, I'm digging up the knowledge that I've gained because it's an important story that needs to be told, not just because I feel we've been left out of history, because we've been involved in so many of the things that have happened in this part of the world. We've been left out of our own story, so many of us. So for me, I'm not digging through dusty archives because I want to know stuff for myself and be academic. I want to be able to share our story with my son, with my sister and her kids, with our other relatives, with the other members of our tribe who come to us just wanting to know, why did I grow up not being told these things? I have an obligation to continue this work because of this man that Curry mentioned, Nicholas Vrooman. He was my mentor. So I was in the very early stages of learning, I grew up knowing that I was Chippewa. My grandmother would tell me that we were Chippewa, but my dad denied it, and I didn't know. But when Nicholas's book, The Whole Country Was One Robe, came out in 2014 or whenever that was, I just happened to be at the Montana Book Festival, and Nicholas happened to be doing a presentation on it, and his book happened to be for sale for like $30. Now it's like $1,000 online because it's out of print and everybody wants it because it's cool to be Little Shell now. I just happened to pick that book up, and in 20 minutes of Dr. Vrooman's presentation, it's like my whole world cracked wide open as far as who I was, where I came from. I get emotional. I'm probably going to cry 3 or 4 times in this presentation, I'll tell you right now, because it was a big deal. So I open the back of the book, and there's all these lettres in the index. And I look at my grandma's side, and there's all these donies in the index. And I like my head exploded. So after the presentation, I went up to Nicholas, and I told him who I was, and he signed it. And I told him I was in the early stages of writing a book, wanting to write a book. And he signed this book for Chris, Track It Down, It's Yours. It was my story. And my book will be published next year. It's called Becoming Little Shell. So yeah, I would not be here right now. I may not be an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe. Who knows what I would be doing if it wasn't for Nicholas Vrooman. So when I talk about carrying it forward, there are a number of us that he influenced through his work that we feel an obligation that we need to pick that torch back up, because he was doing the work of 10 or 12 of us, and we all need to move it forward, and we're committed to doing that, and that's why I'm here. So how did we, the Little Shell, the Métis, get here? I always make these cheat sheets, and I'm already like 5 pages behind, and then I end up just winging it, and half the stuff I get wrong. So nobody knows this stuff. That was Nicholas's point. We weren't alone in not knowing who we are, because nobody knows about it. He told me there's room for 12 professional historians just in the high plains to work their entire careers and never overlap in what they were studying. And there's a reason for that. We weren't Indian enough to be viewed as savages and interesting from an anthropological perspective to white professors, but we weren't white enough to be documented as a cultural group specific to ourselves, which we actually are. So we just kind of fell through the cracks. And, we have, Nicholas would talk about social Darwinism, and that kind of speaks to that. We're this new thing, a mixture of all these old things to become something new. And that, as beautiful a part of our heritage as that is, it also worked against us in the climate of what was considered worth studying as a historian, 50 years ago, or actually we're talking more like 75 years ago. Because it wasn't until after World War II when working class people could join the military and then get the GI Bill and go to college. Now we have working class people instead of elites going into history and starting to talk about working class people. And we were shoulder to shoulder with working class people, working at Black Eagle, outside of Great Falls, at the smelter there. All these different things that we were a part of that people kept stumbling over us. And I'm going to tone it down today because sometimes I can kind of get on a roll like bashing the establishment, bashing the upper towers of academia and all that stuff. But the reality is, if it wasn't for a couple of these white historians, we probably wouldn't be here. We would not be recognized. The amount of work that people like Verne Dusenberry did and Nicholas Vrooman to help us get to where we needed to be, we wouldn't be here. So there definitely is a lot of gratitude that I have for the work of people who kind of bucked the trends, risked their own careers on behalf of us. So there's certainly appreciation for that. Now, whenever I talk about the Little Shell recognition, I like to start at the end, and that is our federal recognition in December 2019, and we were the 574th federally recognized tribe, and I have those numbers tattooed on my knuckles. So this was from the federal recognition celebration in January of 2020 in Great Falls, where we had this room full of people, and everybody who was there wouldn't fit. So they had two other rooms with like video feeds so that everybody could see what was going on. And I certainly had never been in that large of a group of Little Shell people before, and never since, because immediately 2 months later it's COVID, and I don't think we've had a full tribal gathering since then. Have we, Dan? I mean, there's been little things here and there, but as far as everybody getting together, we haven't. So this was it, and it was a big deal. One of the things I enjoyed about it is, I have friends on other reservations that are enrolled with other tribes, and a number of them were there. And it just kind of, exemplified just how related all of our tribes are, how we marry into each other's families, and how connected we are with the Salish and the Kalispel and the Kootenai and the Crow and the big Blackfeet. And we're all connected. We're all married into each other. And that was one of the beautiful things about it. Here's Chairman Gray giving an address. He was probably freaking out. I wonder how many times he's had to talk in front of that many people. I can't talk about how we got here without celebrating anew what we were able to celebrate that day. This, for me, was one of the high points because, of course, the first people who had to take the stage and talk was all the political dignitaries, which, I don't know, there was 8 or 10, and you would think every single one of them single-handedly was the only reason why we got federally recognized, which was kind of what you expect in an election year. But it wasn't until the other tribes took the stage and started doing, they all gave us gifts. And in particular, the Northern Cheyenne, these 3 elders sang an honor song. And that's when it really hit me as far as what we'd gotten to, was the recognition from our families in other tribes. And for me, it was just a beautiful moment. I loved that. Just that we're all indigenous, and we're all in this together. Welcome to our struggle. So I keep talking about federal recognition. What does it even mean? So first of all, federal recognitions of tribes don't happen very often. And when they do, it's usually for small tribes. You'll see them on the East Coast, or you'll see them out in the desert, and you might have 100 enrolled members. But at the time that we got federal recognition, we had something over 5,300 members. I think we're just over 6,000 now. And there's no roadmap for it. So, we get access to health benefits through IHS, Indian Health Services. And then there's other federal programs that are typically administered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the BIA. But the problem is that both of those organizations are massively underfunded, and they are also divided up regionally. So One, like IHS is divided into something like 9 regions, and the BIA is divided up into something like 12 regions. The numbers aren't right, but you get the idea that the whole country and all of the tribes involved are divided into these regions. So you'll have a couple agents who are responsible for vast stretches of geography and all these people. So the process is incredibly slow. So it's not like all of a sudden the switch gets flipped and we have all of these benefits coming to us because we're federally recognized. None of that has happened yet. It's still in process. There's still audits going on and things like that. We'll get some land, sort of. I mean, we have to buy it, but then it gets put into trust. Just like Indian reservations, we won't technically have a reservation. I suppose you could call it that, because it's the relationship is the same, but it's not like a reservation was created by the feds like they did as part of treaties for other tribes. So it's trust land that the government holds in trust for us for tax purposes and for moving forward into perpetuity. And we can add to that if we can prove pieces of land that we would still have to buy and connect back to that original piece. Sovereignty, we are a sovereign nation now. So we have a political relationship with the federal government that we didn't have before. We were recognized by the state in 2000. So we had access to state programs, but now as a federally recognized tribe, we are we're like any other nation on earth when it comes to interacting with the federal government. Now there's lots of little asterisks and caveats and things like that related to that, but we are a sovereign nation. We can make our own rules. We can decide we have our Constitution, we can change that the way we want to fit our needs for how we want to identify ourselves as the Little Shell people. One thing that coming in as a federally recognized tribe got us right out of the gate is that we were in line for CARES Act money for COVID relief. So we went literally from a tribe like a decade ago funding our operations with bake sales and raffles, and our entire tribal council, and I think we had one employee, everybody else was volunteer. All of a sudden we had $25 million. That was our share of the CARES Act money, which was mind-boggling for us. So what we were able to do with that is kind of jumpstart a bunch of programs that we wanted to do as part of federal recognition, but would have taken years, if not decades, to get going. Like infrastructure upgrades. You know, we bought a new building so that we could upgrade this one office building, and we bought a veterinary clinic that we are turning into a health facility for our own people, which is this weekend is when it was supposed to open. I think we've pushed it back again because of COVID, but all of these things. Delivery vehicles so that we could take food out to elders living in all these spread out communities, or give rides to Rocky Boy, you know, wherever the closest IHS facility is, those types of things. All of these things, you know, like Chairman Gray told me, he said, you know, you buy a couple of these vans and you think, man, that's a lot of money. And then you look at your bank account that's got $25 million in it, and it doesn't even make a dent. It's like winning the lottery, you know? It's like, I'm going to buy a new car. Now I have $24,999,950 left, or whatever. I'm not a mathematician. I hope I got that right. So that's really where federal recognition kicked in and helped us right out of the gate. Like months later, less than a year later, we had money to jumpstart programs and move our tribe forward in leaps and bounds that we never would have gotten to otherwise. Like IHS, I wrote an article for Montana Quarterly about tribal response to COVID. And IHS originally told us for them to provide us a health facility. I wrote in the article, they said it would be 100 years because of all of the people already in line and how much money they have and the things they were already committed to. I put $100 or 100 years in the article because the reality that our lawyer told me is that it was 400 years. I said, I can't say 400 years. Who's going to believe me? Because truth is weirder than fiction, right? So 100 years, you can kind of get your head around, boy, that sucks. 400 years sucks. But now we don't have to wait. We have our own. All right, am I talking too fast? I don't want to run out of time. The Métis. I identify as Métis. a lot of the Little Shell people that I know identify as Métis, and when people pronounce, I get called Métis all the time. So that's one of my missions too, is to get people to learn how to pronounce Métis. Who are the Métis? Well, this, when I'm out on the river, is how I imagine myself prowling around out there. I've got my Hudson Bay blanket coat on. I got my flintlock. I got my traps. I don't think I could ever trap, though. I got a sweet leather satchel. I got one here, so that's part of it. But this is the typical image you see of the indigenous-looking guy with that color-coded Hudson Bay. That's the Hudson Bay brand. Literally now, it's like a department store. Typically, you're looking at a Métis guy. Whether they're calling it Blackfeet or Salish or whatever, it's pretty much Métis. So Métis is French for mixed blood, and that's when it's lowercase m. Then you're talking just the standard word in the French language. But if you see a uppercase m, you're talking about a specific cultural group of people that are the result of the early, mostly French explorers and trappers who moved into what is now Canada and married into Indian tribes. And a large part of that was for trade purposes, because Indian tribes would only trade with family. So how are you going to get in the family if you're a French dude? You marry an Indian woman, and now you're family. So that's how it started. And they had children, mixed-race children. And the children would typically keep the father's name, but it was the mom who was teaching them everything. So they learned multiple indigenous languages, Cree, Chippewa, or Ojibwe. They spoke French from their dad. Depending on which tribes were around, they spoke their languages. So moving forward, that was one of the things that Métis people were considered very valuable as, was interpreters, because they could talk to all these different tribes where the French factor running the trading post couldn't. So we were this mixture of multiple worlds that were overlapping in this part of the country all at the same time. And, we like to think of what, say, Montana was like, or North Dakota in those times, as these very specific groups of people. But I've come to think of it like, in Star Wars, when they go to the bar and there's like all these weird aliens and everybody's talking and there's all these languages going on and stuff like, that's what it was like. Because you had Frenchmen, you had English people, you had traditional native people, you had us Métis, who one brother might dress traditional native, the other one might dress like he's from Europe, the third is going to dress a mixture of the two. You had people from the West Coast, like where I live. One of the first references to the Frenchtown Valley is an account in the 1840s of what's Evero Hill. Does anybody here know Evero Hill, coming up out of the Missoula Valley into was originally called Coriacan's Defile. And what a defile is a path between cliffs, like through a canyon. And Coriaca was a Hawaiian dude who was part of a fur trade company, and he was in this group of fur traders going up this defile, and he's killed by Blackfeet. So they named the defile after him, Coriacan's Defile. And it's like, what the heck is a Hawaiian guy doing in Montana in 1840? And I picture them all sitting around the campfire like, okay, who's going to lead the way? And everybody's like this. And Coriaca looks around and he goes, oh, so I'm in front again. So he ends up getting killed. But like, the fur trade companies would hire, they whenever they could, they would have their own fleets too. And they would hire Pacific Islanders as navigators. So I picture this guy, Coriaca, landing in Seattle or Astoria or wherever it was and seeing the range, the Cascades, and thinking, I want to know what's on the other side of those mountains. And that's how he ends up getting killed and remembered when we don't remember anybody else in that group. And it's just this spirit of different peoples mixing that I think we lose track of. And the Métis are part of that. And we're recognized as a cultural group in Canada, but not in the United States. We have our own language, Michif. Sometimes you'll see Métis people identified as Michif people also. It's kind of interchangeable there. The Red River carts, the two-wheeled cart, that's an invention of ours. So the Europeans came here and said, man, these savages are so dumb, they don't even use the wheel. as we're holding our birch bark canoe, which is a marvel of engineering and technology. We didn't need the wheel because we were on rivers and lakes. As soon as we got out on the plains, we come up with the Red River cart, which was the best way to get across these landscapes, getting pulled by an ox, no roads. Like a lot of the roads we have now are just the well-traveled cart tracks of Red River Métis. Mullen Road, John Mullen hired a Métis guide to build his road path on because it was just Métis guy knew where they'd been going for decades. That's what I mean about us being part of all these historical things that nobody knows about. We talk as naturalists where I live, where if you see a raptor like on a telephone pole or flying or whatever, if you call it a red-tailed hawk, 80% of the time you're going to be right because that's mostly what we have. When you see references to French trappers and French Canadians in this part of the world, 80% of the time you're talking Métis. Because even back then, it was getting to the point where if you passed as a French guy, you were going to say you were French. Because already we're being persecuted racially for who we are. So as soon as you started getting people who could say they were French or French Canadian and deny their indigenous side, many of them would choose to do that. And we lost generations where people wake up and they realize, wait, great-great-grandma actually was Chippewa? So yeah, 80% of the time. Because most of the French guys are sitting back, eating bonbons in the trading post, and we're out there doing the real work. Métis. So 1600s and 1700s. So that's when the Hudson Bay Company comes on the scene. In 1670, these two guys originally go to the French because they want to start, they see economic opportunity in the fur trade. And the French aren't interested, so they go to England. And this guy, Prince Rupert, says, yeah, we'll give you a charter to this land. And it becomes Rupert's land. And that's that huge swath right in the middle of what's Canada now. And they basically ran it like their own country. They had complete control over it. So that's where all of these trappers and traders came in and started marrying Indian women. And that's where the whole thing in the late 1600s really gets rolling in the creation of what is now our people. So that drainage was, 1.5 million square miles is what Rupert's land amounted to. I mean, it's huge. And it went down into the United States too. This map isn't really showing that, but it went down a little bit into the USA, like Minnesota and North Dakota. So as the Hudson Bay Company gets going, the French realized that they made a mistake in not kind of financing these guys. So they send this guy, Pierre La Vérendrye, who was a French fur trapper. And in 1738, he goes west with 40 men and 4 sons. And they're considered, so they go into the Turtle Mountains, the Red River drainage. They meet up with a Mandan village about a day's journey from the Missouri River. And that's December 1738. And they're considered the first Europeans to penetrate that far on the northern end of the Rocky Mountains. And chances are others had, but they were the first ones to keep journals of it. And then later, in the 1740s, 2 of La Vérendrye's 4 sons, I think at least one of them died on the original expedition, if not 2 of them, went even further. And this is a painting by the C.W. Jeffries of La Vérendrye's sons, who were considered the first Europeans to see the Front Range. They allegedly went down as far as Wyoming. But what I love about this painting is you can go out on the High Line somewhere, like outside of Great Falls, and it still looks like this. You could find a spot out in all those hills and look towards the Front Range. So it's not hard to squint and imagine. And then you come to the realization that it really wasn't that long ago, a lot of this stuff. Especially when we get into the 1800s and we're talking about post-Civil War. Depending on where my people, which child in the line my dad was, I could have known my great-great-grandfather, right? So And he was one of the we'll get to that. But my point is that there's a lot that, for everything that has changed, there's a lot that hasn't. And that's what I love about this painting, is you can see, this is still what it's like out there. Part of it were the Catholics were always part of this, and we embraced Catholicism. So, there's a strong Catholic connection with the Little Shell and the Métis. But initially, it's not as converts. We didn't view the world monotheistically like the Europeans did. So when the Jesuits come to us and they're talking about this one God and they're talking about Jesus, that's just more power. And we want spiritual power wherever we can get it. So we're like, yeah, Jesus can do all this cool stuff. Right on. I may need that sometime. But it's only over time. And as the relationship changed moving forward, and all of a sudden European women are coming over to North America, and all those early marriages become not recognized by the church because they were of the country. They weren't blessed by a Catholic church. So then some of these men would leave their indigenous wives and remarry under the auspices of the church, European women. But these other families still exist. So then you start to see the separation then of the cultures, and the Métis becoming a strong culture of our own, less tied to the still answering back across the ocean European people. This is St. Mary's Mission down in Stevensville in the Bitterroot Valley. So this is 1841. And one of the things that DeSmet had is he had a couple illustrators with him. And one of his guys did this. I mean, it's a beautiful illustration. But what I love about it is, see right there in the middle of the picture is a Red River cart. DeSmet was brought to the Bitterroot Valley by a Métis guy. Gabriel Prudhomme was his name. Dan, I hope you yell at me if I get some of these names wrong. Gabriel Prudhomme is the same guy 20 years later, to guide John Mullen building the Mullen Road. Same guy. And DeSmet gets all this credit for bringing Catholicism to the savages when the Métis were already up and down these valleys for 50, 100 years, long before the official arrival of Catholicism. We already had those Catholic folk tales and ways of viewing the world from going back into the mid-1700s. So it's not like it was anything new to the people who already lived there. But I love that Red River cart right in the middle of this drawing. This is a picture I took from the top of Mount Sentinel that overlooks Missoula. If I was facing this, standing on where I took the picture, to my left would be Missoula, and right down there in the bottom of the valley is East Missoula, and that's Mount Jumbo. And this picture is there because this canyon between those two mountains is called Hellgate Canyon. And that's one of those places that were named allegedly by French explorers and French trappers when actually it's the Métis. We named it the Gates of Hell because the Blackfeet would ambush travelers between these, right through this pass that you have to go through. And it was like a indigenous superhighway from east to west, where tribes west of this valley would travel to the other side to hunt buffalo. So everybody was going back and forth through here, and the Blackfeet were ambushing everybody. So that's why it was the Gates of Hell. Missoula was originally named Hellgate Durand at the confluence, the first trading post, the Hellgate Trading Post. There's a little convenience store called the Hellgate Trading Post on Mullen Road, because the initial little trading town, whatever you want to call it, was right at the confluence of the Blackfoot, or of the Bitterroot and Clark Fork rivers. So Hellgate Canyon, we claim that. 1850s and 1860s, this is what a Red River settlement would look like, in North Dakota. And what is interesting to me about it is you start to see, so we've got our Red River carts, you see that the teepees. So you have evidence of people living traditionally, but on the other side of the palisade, you've got houses and things. So we're seeing this overlap of traditional ways versus more modern ways. So our people might have a house in town, like in Pembina, but when we go out, when we load up our cart and we go out for a year or two and we're going to hunt buffalo and do whatever, we're going to live out on the plains in our teepees and our tents, and then come back and live in a house again. So you see that already starting to happen. This is in the 1850s. Here's a photograph of some Métis folks, Chippewa folks, with their Red River carts. So 1853, Isaac Stevens comes from the East Coast, and he plays a big role, not just for us, but for a lot of indigenous. I mean, kind of rewrites how we interact, even today. So 1853, he takes the gig to be the governor of Washington Territory, which Western Montana is a part of at this time. But he's also tasked with mapping a route from like the Great Lakes region, Minneapolis, to Seattle for the railroad. So he's I don't know why I'm losing the word, surveying the route and making arrangements with all the Indians to know who's where. So he starts having these discussions with tribes pretty much south of the Missouri, with the plan being to come back after he's made his trip west to deal with the tribes north of the Missouri, which would be us. We were part of that group. One of the things that he does that's significant is the Hellgate Treaty of 1855. This is at Council Grove. I go to Council Grove every day. And this is the treaty that moved the Salish out of the Bitterroot Valley up north into the Flathead Valley. And if you want to, you could just study that one treaty and the after effects and know everything there is that's terrible about the United States interactions with indigenous people. It's all there in what happened to the Salish people. And Stevens was part of that. This is encompassed in the red line is what we would call the territory of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, which is who Little Shell comes out of at the height of our power, like going back to the 1860s, like around 1850s into 1860s. The Turtle Mountain Chippewa controlled this terrain, and it slowly starts to get taken away. But the point about Stevens is Civil War happens, and he's the only one who knows about all these, arrangements and who they're going to talk to next, and he gets killed in the Civil War. So they never come back to deal with the tribes north of the Missouri in the same way that they moved around like the Blackfeet and the Cheyenne and all these folks for the railroad to go through. So that's kind of like the first point where things are starting to look bad for us, is when Stevens dies. Because it's already inevitable that there's going to be some kind of interaction with the federal government, whether it's war or treaty or whatever, for us. I just put this in to see a lot. Sometimes you'd have 1,000 of these carts lined up, and they didn't use grease. So the squeak would be heard for miles. Any writing you see from the time that when these were actually in use, they make a point to talk about just the horrific screeching of these things rolling across the plains with no oil, no lubrication. First, they didn't have any. Then when they did get some, they realized that the axle grease would just pick up rocks and chew up the axles and ruin the axle wheel configuration. So they stopped doing that and just lived with the squeaking. Can you imagine like the permanent ear ringing you would have after if you did that a lot? So 1860s, Civil War happens, Stevens gets killed. Now we're moving into the late 1870s, or into the 1870s. And already, because we're a buffalo hunting tribe, the buffalo are pretty much about gone by the 1870s. It's the last big buffalo herds in the 1870s are in central Montana up into Alberta. So that's where we start going. And our family structure of large groups living together in communities is already starting to fracture because there's not enough resources to support large groups in the way that we hunted, and we traded in buffalo hides, and we traded in pemmican, and all these things. All of those things are being taken away from us, just from this influx of culture and bodies, people moving west, especially after the Civil War. So we're already starting to break up. 1871, after the Civil War, the federal government says, we're not going to make treaties with Indian people anymore. So no more treaties after 1871. So we never had the opportunity to make any kind of a treaty for us to establish ourselves prior to this time period. And this is where, like I mentioned at the start, the Métis archipelago, we start dividing up, breaking into smaller groups, and living on the fringes of all these communities all over Montana. I'm going to talk specifically about Lewistown, because that's where my family's from, but Anaconda, down in the Bitterroot, living on the reservations that have been established for other tribes. Right here in Helena, Moccasin Flats in Helena, which isn't that far away from where we are right now. Anywhere that there were dumps or slaughterhouses or any of these things that we could scavenge from, that's where we tended to live, because we weren't allowed to live anywhere else. One thing that can easily be lost in the discussion of a lot of these things is just how horrible it was to be an Indian at that time. 1876, Custer gets his ass handed to him at the Battle of Little Bighorn. 1877, the Nez Perce almost make it to Canada. The United States government is freaking out because they don't have nearly enough troops in this part of the country, and everybody's afraid that Sitting Bull is going to raise this huge army in Canada and sweep down out of the north and take everything back over. We don't often get to see that version of history. It's simplified, but it was a powder keg in this part of the country in the mid to late 1870s going into the 1880s. So all these forts get established. Fort Missoula gets built. Fort Assiniboine up in Havert gets built. All of these places, just this fear that the Indians are coming. And meanwhile, we're trying to find our place on the outskirts of all these other communities. Lewistown. So 1879, a group of families from the Red River Valley who had come across in the Milk River Valley, and there was a lot of Métis settlements on the Milk River Valley, moved south into the Judith Basin and Spring Creek in Lewistown. They found what is now the town of Lewistown, Montana. So there was like 20 families, and that's where for me, that's where my family history kind of starts as far as the people I really know about, is both my grandfather and my grandma's family were part of those families that came and founded Lewistown. And in a lot of the popular history, you'll hear them as, oh, they're hunting buffalo, and they found this valley where there was still a lot of game, and the people who wanted to live more traditionally could, because there was still hunting there, and the people who were ready to start this transition to like an agricultural existence could do that too. But the reality is that those families knew that they're about to get run out of the Milk River Valley, which is exactly what happened. Nelson Miles, was it 1880? They just start, if you're not in Lewistown, we're burning you out. And they literally burned out homesteads, farms, little towns all along the Milk River. A lot of these pictures that you'll see of these brave homesteaders, the reality is just like what happened on the East Coast with the Cherokee. About the time the Indian family's leaving their house to be driven west, the white family's moving into their house. That happened on the Milk River to us. We were driven out of there. Part of it was that fear. They were afraid that the Métis were involved in supplying the Lakota with guns in the wake of the Little Bighorn. Some of that probably was happening, but for the most part, it was like, you're not wanted here anymore. You don't belong here. You weren't given any land to live on, and you can't live here because this is for white people. So that's part of what is moving us all over the countryside. I talked about most of that. This is Reed's Fort. This is in this cool little museum in Lewistown that has a nice little section on the Métis people who founded it. I like to bring up Reed's Fort, which was a trading post, because it was built, it's still there, like right in a little weird, it's like this little trading post, and it's surrounded by, just in a normal neighborhood. I like to bring it up, sketchy tourist in the sketchy tourist pose outside Reed's Fort. I'm getting to it. It was built by that guy, or largely by that guy, Mose Latreille. That's my great-great-grandfather. And your grandfather. And my great-great-grandmother, Susie, was a Assiniboine. She was picked up as an infant and adopted into a family because her family was being chased by the cavalry because they left the reservation. And I often get emotional. When we talk about so much of that stuff with the cavalry chasing Indians like it's ancient history, it's possible, if depending on when I was born, that I could have known this guy. It's just my great-great-grandfather. My great-great-grandmother. History, we're still in the middle of it. We're still feeling the repercussions of the things that happened to these people that we probably all know someone who could have known them. So it's recent. That's the thing that just really just hits me every time. All these surly-looking people, those are all Latreilles in Lewistown. A big family picture. We can't talk about the Métis, we can't even talk about Helena as it relates to the Métis without talking about Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. So these two guys were the leaders of a Métis, like independence movement, I guess I would call that. So first in the 1860s, 1869, 1870, Louis Riel, he's this kind of weird, really smart, like mystical guy that people who evaluate now say he was probably bipolar or maybe schizophrenic because he had these weird swings, but he was a genius. And he was the leader in trying to establish a Métis homeland in Canada. 1869, 1870, he leads this uprising of Red River Métis, which ultimately leads to the establishment of Manitoba as a Canadian province, but we're left out of that. And he has to go into exile in Montana because he had a guy killed that he probably shouldn't have had killed, but can't make a cake without busting a few eggs, I guess. So he's in Montana, and he lived in Helena. I have the address. 203 North Rodney Street is where the building is different now, but that's where Louis Riel lived for a short time. You know, he was involved in the community here. He taught school up at St. Peter's, gets married, has a couple kids, ultimately becomes a U.S. citizen. But then he gets called back again in 1885 to lead another rebellion in Saskatchewan, and they just get destroyed. And he ends up getting hanged for treason against the Queen, even though he's an American citizen. So the Métis people and Louis Riel are much more visible in Canada than they are here. So, I mean, there are people in Helena, like if I know there's talk in Helena about some kind of a Louis Riel monument and making where he lived something notable so that we can pick off Canadian tourists coming through here. You know, Louis Riel is a big deal for the Métis people, and it's still a very controversial figure in Canada as to whether or not he was an enemy or a hero. And it's one of those names, again, like when we talk about just telling this story, how much is lost on this side of the medicine line of how important we've been. All right, so I talked about Louis. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed things up a little bit. 1880s, 1890s, things are dire for us because everything that we've used to survive on is pretty much going away. Here's in the 1880s, this is like one of those houses I'm talking about that on the Milk River we would have that we got chased out of. But here's where Little Shell, for whom our name derives, comes from. So Little Shell was actually a hereditary title. So Little Shell here is Little Shell the Third. And here's a photo, a colorized photo, which I wish it was black and white because it looks like a zombie thing because the color's so weird. But these are Little Shell band members in the Turtle Mountains, is what this photograph is of. So we go back like into the 1850s. Little Shell I was one of two principal chiefs of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa to be involved in the Treaty of 1863 at Old Crossing, which tomorrow I leave because for the first time the Little Shell have been invited for a commemoration of the Treaty of Old Crossing, and that's happening Saturday. So I get to drive 14 hours tomorrow to get to Minnesota to do this Old Crossing thing. But when that treaty went sour, Little Shell I said, we are never signing anything with the United States government again because they never hold up their end of the bargain. And for me, when we talk about dates, I feel like that's kind of where things really start to unravel for us. Because we've taken this adversarial position, rightfully so, and all of the bureaucrats who are doing all the dirty work now, as opposed to, military, are going to hold that against us. And that's one of the things we talk about, as these reservations are getting shrunk. The Turtle Mountain Reservation was 450,000 acres. 2 years later, it gets cut to 46,000. And we have all of these people who not only live there, but also are still spread out and would come home. So our population is greater than what they would see living on the reservation. They say, well, if you're not living here, you're not living the way we want you to, so you're not part of this tribe. And that's also part of how we ended up landless. It's because, Little Shell and his band and all the people related to all of these people who were in Turtle Mountain get written off because they didn't stay home. Well, why would we? That's how we've lived for 1,000 years, right? But the ultimate blow is the Macomber Agreement in 1892, which you'll hear referred to as the 10-cent treaty. He came out and wanted to buy all this land at 10 cents an acre. Little Shell wanted $1, and they couldn't find agreement. And people talk about, well, Little Shell is out hunting buffalo at Fort Benton, which is kind of true. He's out there. But he had just come from Washington, D.C. So this is a battle of lawyers and bureaucrats. It's not guns blazing out on the plains anymore. It's the way we screw people now. It's with paperwork. Let's write it as unintelligibly as possible so that nobody knows really what they're getting into. So when Little Shell says, I am not going to do this, and this is like the Wikipedia version, Macomber says, okay, I'm going to find 32 Indians who will. I'm going to tell everybody they are chiefs, and when they sign the agreement, the deal is done, and we are suddenly landless. Just like that. Literally just like that. So when people say things like, yeah, well, let's say Indian mascots. Well, I talk to Indians, and they think it's an honor. Well, you can find Indians who are going to agree to anything. Just like you can find anybody who's going to agree to anything that's against their long-term best interests if it seems like it's going to work out well for them right now. And that's kind of what happened with the Macomber Commission, is Macomber finds 32 people who think they're getting a good deal right now, but long-term, they're hosed. And that happened all across the plains. So we go the next 156 year or 128 years or whatever it is as landless. But first in 1896, we get the Cree Deportation Act. And that's like the final thing that the government's going to try and do. What the Cree Deportation Act of 1896 was an effort by the United States to say, we're going to get rid of the Indian problem once and for all. We're going to call all of these mixed-race Indians, or basically any Indians that aren't on a reservation on the northern plains, we're going to say they're refugees from the Louis Riel Rebellion in 1885. We're going to call them Canadian Cree Indians, and we're going to deport them all back to Canada where they belong, which a number of us had lived back and forth for generations. So they get $5,000 operating out of Fort Assiniboine in Havre, the 10th Cavalry, which was the Buffalo Soldiers, the black soldiers, led by John Pershing, who later in his career becomes the supreme Allied commander in World War I. He was called Blackjack Pershing because he led the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, but it wasn't Black Jack. They used a much more creative N-word Jack for many years for what they called him, because he led the Black Regiment, the Black Cavalry, the 10th Cavalry. But over the course of about 4 months, they round up all the Indians they can find, put them on cattle cars, on trains, and ship them to Canada. When they run out of money, they do it on foot. So this is all over Montana. This, not just the High Line in Great Falls, Shoto. There was a community up in the Teton Canyon for generations. They round those folks up. We know about, in 1891, the Salish being the last band of Salish being marked over Higgins Bridge right through downtown Missoula to take them up to the Flathead Reservation. 5 years later, a group of Métis and even just French people, same thing. They march them right up Higgins Avenue on their way to put them on trains and send them to Canada. So that was like the last effort to get rid of the Indians in the Northern Plains. But what happened is, like, as soon as they dropped them off, we all ran back. So we would either hide out with family on other reservations, or we continued to live on the outskirts of places like Great Falls, or like on Hill 57, which we could do a whole presentation on Hill 57, which was kind of like our last, what we would call the capital of the Little Shell, or kind of our last stand, if you want to call it. But there were lots of reasons why we ended up on Hill 57. Point is, we're still landless. They tried to get rid of us. We came back to where we belong, and we're living on these fringes, for the next 30, 40 years. There's a picture of Hill 57. So all of these, like I mentioned, Moxon Flats here in Helena, Buckskin Flats, they'd call them breed towns because we were called half-breeds. I took this picture out of Nicholas's book, summing up what we see today. And that's a whole nother tangent I can go on, is the way history doesn't move forward in a straight line. It just swirls and swirls and swirls and circles and layers. So when we see a photograph of these desperately poor Indians in downtown Butte, and this wealthy guy is kind of looking down his nose at him, I can go out maybe here in Helen, I don't spend a lot of time in Helen, but I know in Missoula, I can see the exact same thing in the courthouse right now. They aren't necessarily indigenous people, but what they are is people whose circumstances, largely not of their own, have put them out to live on the fringes of communities, whether that's the housing crisis we have right now, losing work, nowhere to work, a health industry that doesn't take care of people, so that if you have a mental illness or any other number of problems, you end up on the street, and we don't ever want to see them. So to me, like, when I see homeless people, houseless people in Missoula, I see my people. And I see a culture that widely has not learned how to take care of each other. Because if we have the resources to take care of everybody, and we choose not to. So I cannot get on a high horse about, homeless people, they just don't care, they're just drunks, they don't want to work. No, there are reasons for this, because my family suffered for reasons like that. Rocky Boy Reservation gets created in 1916. We're related to those folks, the Chippewa Cree. Initially, the reservation was supposed to be for all of us mixed race people, but there just wasn't enough land. So they fit what they could, and the rest of us were still on the fringes. Joe Dusenberry, who was the interview subject in Verne Dusenberry's article that I named the presentation after, that was his main person that he talked to, was one of the first, like, as we get into the 20s and 30s and 40s, this movement to get federal recognition is already happening. So it's going for decades, for a couple generations. I mean, Louis Riel had a petition in 1880 for a reservation to be created in central Montana that both of my great-great-grandfathers in Lewistown were signatories of. And Nelson Miles was in favor of it, but they couldn't get the federal government to agree to it. So it's not a new thing. We've been trying for this for pretty much the whole time. We submitted, last I heard, I think it was actually 80,000 pages of documentation in support, proving who we were, why we deserve to be, why we were an established tribe, why we should be federally recognized. We get recognized by the state in 2000. 2018, we get one vote away. Jackass from Utah. I mean, you could have read that, but I just like pointing out that Mike Lee from Utah is a jackass, because he single-handedly denied us another year of federal recognition for no other reason than that he could. I don't think it's a good idea. Meanwhile, 300 and 400 other people have said, yeah, it is a good idea. But then the day that finally came, federal recognition, December 2019. Then we have our celebration in January. It was a long time coming. And so many people who gave their lives to get us federal recognition were no longer here to see it happen. Nicholas Vrooman died 6 months before he saw it happen. I think he was pretty convinced at that point that it was going to happen, but he didn't get to see it. Thanks, Mike Lee. So what's next for us? You know, I get that asked all the time because, like I said, people tend to, look at all these pages I am behind. A switch doesn't get flipped and all of a sudden things are different. Like, we are in a position now where we can kind of become the people that we want to become. And that's where, you know, we have this weird relationship between people who traditionally want to practice Chippewa culture. Yet we have old elders like from Shoto or the High Line who grew up in Métis families, and the celebrations are different. So we're still navigating this overlap of multiple cultures. And what does that mean for us as a unified whole? And I get frustrated with members who say, you know, I live in Idaho. I'm not going to go to a health clinic in Great Falls. What do I care? I just want to check. Well, that's no way to look at what it is. Again, it's that what's happening now versus what we're trying to do in the future. I'm not going to really see any benefits for our federal recognition, but my son might. If you have kids, they might. What we're doing now is trying to adjust to the long-term view versus this, what kind of return on my investment can I get right now? I think that's our biggest struggle, is trying to figure out how we are going to how to keep everybody happy, as many as we can, and still set these foundations for something that's going to be positive for us moving forward long into the future. Doesn't help when you get federal recognition like right on the doorstep of a global pandemic. So obviously that's made things challenging. But at least we have the opportunity. We're not just we're not on Capitol Hill arguing with white dudes who heard the words little shell 10 minutes earlier and say, oh no, that's not a good idea. Now we're in a position to kind of control our own destiny, at least to a certain degree. And with that, does anybody have any questions? God, an hour goes. Why doesn't it go this fast like at 3 a.m. when I'm awake and want to be asleep? Yes? Clinic is in Great Falls, yes. Mm-hmm. Dan, do you know, I know the grand opening was going to be this weekend, but it's been pushed back, right? Do you know?
I believe so.
Yeah.
One of the things that people don't realize, you get the clinic, Indian Health Service is so underfunded. Traditionally on a reservation, the first 2 months of the new year, you get real services, and the rest of the year, it's life and limb. So it isn't the greatest thing in the world. In the United States, we spend more money on federal prisoners than we do on Native Americans. And if you're an urban Indian, it gets down to about 30% of what you spend on a federal prisoner, you spend on the urban Indian. And 67% Indians live off reservation, so we're all urban. So it's not a great lifesaver, but
It's a step in the right direction.
it helps.
Mm-hmm.
Does Medicaid and Medicare come in? All the stuff between Indian Health Services and
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
If you really want, when it come in and look pretty good, the Lewistown Clinic in Helen is named after my father, and that was the first clinic in Montana that offered free services to anybody. And we, as urban programs, were the first ones to be able to cross-bill Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance, CHIP, and subsidize our programs with that money to go in with our Indian Health Service money. So it goes into operating that clinic and it gets rolled in, and it's amazing that the VA hasn't tried that.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How is the tribe reaching out to kind of build its enrollment, given that it's scattered throughout the US?
I'm going to repeat the question because they asked me to do that. How's the tribe reaching out? Well, for one thing, you know, it was big news when we got federal recognition. So automatically you see, like, our enrollment applications have really gone through the roof. You know, we do things like that's one of the things we've been able to improve too, is just our communication. Like I talk about in my book, when I was first trying to get enrolled, how the website was essentially useless. But that's one of the things that when you finally have some money to operate, you can create. We've got social media accounts. We've got, you know, I just signed up for a thing where I get texts on my phone whenever I get notices. So that's one of those things that we have to evaluate. How can we improve how we communicate with our members? Because like me, as a person who does not use Facebook, anything that's just going out to Facebook, I'm never going to see. And there was a time when that was frustrating. But now, yeah, I mean, it's like anything else. We've got a website and we use social media. And one of the things that we did when we got the COVID money is there was a survey that you could fill out if you were affected negatively by COVID, whether it was work or getting behind on bills or whatever. You could apply for COVID relief. That opportunity got us names and addresses and phone numbers and all those things. So it's an ongoing process, but it's definitely improved. Anyone else? Well, thank you for your time. Yes.
That last elders meeting,
Mm-hmm.